Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, you're very quiet.
Okay,
Maybe I need to turn you up on mine.
what about now?
Okay, I've got you turned all the way up. Can anyone hear Dr. Clavin?
Testing, testing.
Let's see here, chat. Okay, Terry can hear you. Perfect. Okay. I'll just turn you up on. Okay, perfect. Oh, Kenneth. Kenneth raised his hand.
My volume.
Okay, Mr. Lowe, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
I see the mute button.
You need to unmute yourself.
I was responding. Can I hear him? Yes, I could hear him.
Oh, yes, you can. Perfect. Thank you.
I hear you perfectly as
Okay. Great. All right, then we will get started. I feel like I'm not in the center or something. Well, I am blocking your book. My name is Lacey Ballinger, and I am the Director of Collections and Exhibits here at the Tallahassee Museum. And thank you all for joining us this evening for our latest issue of Museum Mixology. This week, we are doing a toast to history, of course. It is a virtual lecture series that we always offer on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. And the purpose of this series is to offer a variety of unique educational experiences. I hope you each had a chance to go by Madison Social and pick up a cocktail to go, or curbside to go, because those proceeds, a portion of them, do come back to the museum. And if you didn't, we would love it if you could contribute to our tip jar, which I put in the chat room, the link to the tip jar. If you are able to contribute, we would greatly appreciate it, because your contributions go very far here. So tonight we are going to be talking about the Battle of Negro Fort with Dr. Matthew Clavin. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, Major General Andrew Jackson ordered a joint United States Army-Navy expedition into Spanish Florida to destroy a free and independent community of fugitive slaves. The result was the Battle of Negro Fort, a brutal conflict among hundreds of American troops, Indian warriors, and Black rebels that culminated in the death of re-enslavement of nearly all of the fort's inhabitants. Dr. Matthew Clavin, who is from the University of Houston, writes and teaches in the areas of American and Atlantic history with a focus on the history of race, slavery, and abolition. He received his PhD at American University in 2005 and is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships from the American Antiquarian Society, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and many others. So without further ado, we're going to welcome Dr. Clavin, and he is going to tell us all about the Battle of Negro Fort and give us the opportunity to go out and buy his book, I hope, which, I don't know if you can see it behind me, is the cover. If I lean over maybe, the Battle of Negro Fort. There you are. All right, thank you, Dr. Clavin, for being here all the way from Houston, Texas.
Okay, first off, I should introduce you to my dog, Rufus, who is barking at a FedEx man right now. So he is about to calm down. So we'll hear him throughout the hour. I have 3 teenagers going in and out throughout the hour. I have a wife who's louder than the 3 teenagers combined. So there will be plenty of distractions, I'm sure. This is the new normal.
That is new.
Is there an enable me to share my screen so I can show a couple PowerPoints? My Zoom is telling me the host disabled attendee screen sharing.
The answer is no.
They don't have experts doing these things at times.
No, it takes, forget it. Just go on with your lecture.
Well, some lectures are based around a slide.
Oh, I think I'm getting it. Hold on a second.
What does it say?
Desktop. Let's see.
Like,
Can you all see the PowerPoint?
No.
no.
Let's see, let me try one more time.
If you go down to the bottom of your screen and hit share screen.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, it's not still sharing screen.
Yeah, it's showing me that it's sharing with all panelists, but
Not anyone else, because I can't see it either.
let me try one more time. Sorry, everybody.
Mr. Lowe, would you turn your mute on, please?
I don't see it. Oh, there it is. Now I see it.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Who can share? Who can start sharing? Host.
Okay. No, that's my screen. I don't know why it does this to me.
Oh, here we go. Let me click on share.
There, yes.
All
Now
right,
we
good.
can see you.
Good. And it's not that essential, but a couple nice images. Okay, so thank you all for inviting me. Lacey, specifically, thank you. You are all entering dangerous territory whenever you ask an author to talk about something that took them many years to write and get published, and to do it in less than an hour is nearly impossible. And thanks to the pandemic, I haven't had an opportunity to talk about my book as much as I would like to. The year anniversary is approaching when the book first came out, and pretty fascinating how now that the year anniversary is almost upon us. It'll be September of last year when the book came out. It's funny now, I can thumb through it and I start to rethink things. And after book reviews are coming out now, I've done a lot of interviews about the book. I assigned it in the class summer and talked to students about it, and it's really interesting. When I wrote the book, I was living in Pensacola at the time. I taught at the University of West Florida for 6 years. And I wrote a book called Aiming for Pensacola about fugitive slaves and their allies in Pensacola and along the Gulf of Mexico and Florida primarily. But I also knew when I was there, I wanted to write something really in depth about Negro Fort, which I had known about for many years, and not many people know about it. Not many people have written about it. I never knew if I would have enough information, but ultimately I had more than enough information. But when I wrote the book, I was focused on the 19th century for obvious reasons. The book looks at Andrew Jackson, it looks at the US military, looks at fugitive slaves, looks at Native Americans. But it's interesting, the last year, as we all know, strange, important, stressful times in American history. And now when people talk to me about immigration, and they ask me about the southern border, and they ask me about institutional racism and the role of the state in oppressing African American people, and all this stuff is in my book. I didn't mean to make it resonate with sort of a lot of current events. Fortunately or unfortunately, it absolutely. I think the book is just really important. It tells a story about Florida Panhandle history that most people, even living on the Florida Panhandle, have very little knowledge about. So in the next hour or so, I'll just try to give a quick summary, try to hit sort of some of the main points. And the goal, like any historian, is just to enlighten people and to make things, maybe sort of make you rethink a little bit about Florida history, American history. And I'll tell you, a lot of historians, or the few historians who have written and published work on Negro Fort, and typically it's articles or part of a chapter or part of a larger project. They typically do it from the point of view of Spanish American history or Atlantic or global history, and I do a bunch of that for sure. But I really wanted to tell this story from the viewpoint of U.S. history. I actually wrote this book to use in several of my U.S. history classes because I thought that library shelves, and I still think library shelves are very thin when it comes to the issue of race in the first decade or two of the 19th century. We all know when we get to the middle of the 19th century and the Civil War, pretty much everything historians have to say is about the expansion of slavery, the rise of the slave power, the rise of the abolition movement, the Underground Railroad. Next thing you know, Lincoln is elected and we have Civil War. But most historians who know the early 19th century and even earlier, they know that race has always been a problem in American history. The quote unquote Indian problem was a major issue at the turn of the 19th century. The role of the British along the Gulf of Mexico, other parts of North America, that was a major issue. And this book sort of just pulls all of these things together. So I'll go kind of quickly because honestly, when I do something like this, I find it most interesting when you all ask questions and I give feedback, and I may have questions for you. And so I don't want to bore you. I don't want to belabor any sort of things. I'll hit the high, but I really like hearing some of your questions and comments. So let's start with the background very quickly with the War of 1812. Some people still refer to it as the Second American Revolution. I had a professor in graduate school. He wrote a book called about the War of 1812 called Redeeming the Republic. And so for many people, the War of 1812 was a war of the United States, of the American people to redeem themselves in the world's eyes. And I tell students this all the time, and most people aren't quite aware of this, but the colonists won American independence from the British in the American Revolution, but for nearly 30 years, the British mocked, scoffed at the idea of American independence. They controlled the Atlantic Ocean, they attacked our ships, they hijacked our goods, they kidnapped and impressed in the Navy our soldiers, and Americans simply just weren't free. We acted like we were, and we had a constitution, and we had all these things being formulated, but the British still controlled, certainly disrespected us on a daily basis. 1812, the United States declares war on Britain for many of the reasons I just mentioned, and the war is going to be a short-lived war, 2 years. But what I focus on is how this war is going to impact Florida along the Gulf of Mexico. So during the War of 1812, Florida represents two separate Spanish colonies, many of you know, East and West Florida. If you look at the PowerPoint map, the Apalachicola River divides East and West Florida. And in 1814, the British begin to land hundreds of troops at Apalachicola Bay. And that's really where this whole story picks up. By 1814, the British were getting a little frustrated, weren't as successful as they expected to be against the United States. And so they sort of adopted, as they did in the American Revolution, a quote unquote Southern strategy. Most of the fighting in the War of 1812 and 1812, 1813 was in the far north and northeast. Actually, much of it was in Canada, certainly along the Canadian border. But after a year or two, the British will do what they tried in the American Revolution, and that is to hit the United States or the Americans where they were at their weakest point. And their weakest point was where there were countless Native Americans and African Americans. Why does that make the United States weak? Because both of these groups, Indians and slaves in particular, they will volunteer for the British. They will fight for anyone who promises them freedom, or in the case of Indians, land. So in 1814, when the British begin arriving at Appalachian Bay, they carry a bunch of proclamations with them. And they had first used these on the East Coast of the United States beginning in 1813, also 1814. And through these various proclamations, and they're just documents that they publish, they print hundreds of copies and they distribute them throughout these territories. They are promising fugitive slaves if they join the British military. Some of these proclamations promise land permanently to Native Americans if they fight with the British against the Americans. A lot of these documents are available online now. They're amazing. The language, the way the British are, again, mocking the idea of American freedom. And, you have to be careful with the British. They are definitely doing their best to recruit Indians and slaves to their cause. In many cases, they have no special affinity for Indians or slaves, but they're trying to defeat the Americans. That being said, by the War of 1812, going back to the American Revolution, many Americans were getting very frustrated with this British tactic of helping Indians, helping slaves to defeat the Americans. And certainly, and historians have written about how the American Revolution, although it's often celebrated as a great war of independence and freedom and democracy, etc., many people in America at the time, as the Atlantic world at the time, they would recognize the British as the true fighters. The British are assisting Indians. The British will free slaves long before the United States will ever consider it. Britain does it voluntarily. The United States, it takes a violent civil war. But here's a great quotation from an American sailor during the War of 1812. And he says, "It is all," and he's complaining about the British here, "it is all liberty and equality with them. They fight the battles of the world for freedom. They accept all sorts in their camp, the Indians, the mulattoes, the Negroes, and whomsoever they can get." And so from the American Revolution through the War of 1812, the British have this penchant for accepting any recruit into their services, their armed forces, in order to defeat the United States. So this is what's going on in the spring and summer of 1814 along Florida's Gulf, specifically Apalachicola Bay. The British are going to start to bring all these recruits, take many of their soldiers, and they begin to build what's called the British Post. And today, if you go to the Apalachicola National Forest, there's it used to be called Fort Gadsden. Today, they've renamed it recently to Prospect Bluff. And Prospect Bluff is simply, it's a bluff. It's almost a small cliff. It's about 10, 15 feet. It's a 10, 15-foot rise above the Apalachicola River. Prior to the War of 1812, or I should say, prior to the arrival of the British in 1814, the very famous independent merchant company of Patley, they had a store, and historians have compared them to the Walmart, Florida. But what we really have is a trading post. And you might have a log cabin or two. You might have some chickens and some cows, a tanning building, a couple of slaves, something like that. And so there was a small little storehouse there, and the British just took it over when they arrived in the spring of 1814. They immediately free the slaves who were working there, and they welcome them into the British military. So at this site, Prospect Bluff, summer of 1814, the British erect what becomes known as the British Post. And really for the next 2 years, this becomes very famous across the United States. People hear about the British amassing this force of white British soldiers and sailors, Native Americans, and African American slaves. Now, the British make a big mistake. They telegraph their next move. Take all of these troops, and they're going to, as part of their Southern strategy, attack New Orleans. And you all know how that ends, not well for the British. In January of 1815, Andrew Jackson, his ragtag army of volunteers, they just destroy the British. One historian calls it, quote, one of the worst disasters ever suffered by a British army. People who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars for years are just obliterated and just blown away by the way the United States destroyed them. The casualties, it was like 100 British casualties towards American casualties. So now this is where our story really picks up speed, because it is about to defeat the British in the War of 1812, months for the treaty to be ratified by the US Congress and other things. But in the spring of 1815, the British begin withdrawing their troops from Florida. And eventually by June, they do. So by June of 1815, you have this large fort or British post that's left by the British. It's been abandoned with the exception of two groups of people. There's several hundred Native Americans and several hundred fugitive slaves. These Indians are Creeks, they're Seminoles, they're Choctaws, all over the American Southeast, particularly along the Florida border. These fugitive slaves, they are also from the southern United States, from the Florida American border, the US border, but I think, and I'm pretty accurate about this, the majority are from Spanish Florida. They're Spanish speakers. Most of them have Hispanic sounding names. Many of them were Spanish slaves. And when they saw the British troops offering them weapons and redcoats for freedom, they joined the British at the British post. So by the spring, early summer of 1815, British have departed. And then you have the Indians, the vast, they withdraw. And people ask the question, well, why did the Indians leave? Well, they, were migratory people by the War of 1812, many of them. Many of them were Creeks. They had already migrated to Florida to join the British. Now the British abandoned them. They feel left out. They feel disappointed. They don't trust the British. Leave the British post. And they disperse to, East Florida, other parts of North Florida. Bottom line is, by the summer of 1815, pretty much the only people remaining at the former British post are African American slaves. Fugitive slaves, runaway slaves. Many of them are now veterans of the British Marines. Some of them had fought at the Battle of New Orleans for the British. Many of them, the men at least, are literally wearing British red coats. And at this point in time, there's an American Indian agent in southern Georgia. His name is Benjamin Hawkins. And he's a big slave owner. He's a slave trader. And he is just absolutely distraught by what he sees. He starts to send a series of quote unquote spies to the former British post. And he, Benjamin Hawkins, summer of 1815, he terms the former British post quote unquote Negro Fort. And to this day in the 21st century, this fort is now known as Negro Fort. And I think it's important to sort of understand the significance of that. By calling it Negro Fort, it is sort of sending messages to many people in the United States that this thing is a threat. And as everyone knows, the cotton gin is invented in 1790. Slavery is expanding across the continent. This becomes part of this American mission. As part of Manifest Destiny, quite frankly, is to spread slavery and cotton across the American Southeast and eventually the Southwest, all the way past where I live today in Houston, Texas. 1815, Benjamin Hawkins and many other slave owners, they see Negro Fort as a problem. And it is a problem on several levels. But honestly, it's not a threat. Former slaves at Negro Fort, they may be coats, they may have fought the Americans during the war, but they're not looking to fight the United States anymore. Quite honestly, all these people do is want to be left alone. They simply want their freedom. They want the protection of this fort. They have Indian allies, and they want to be left alone. So very quickly, let me just tell you about this fort. At its peak, there's going to be about 1,000 runaway slaves, the majority from Spanish Florida, but increasingly throughout 1850, by the hundreds, Southern American slaves join them. So really, the threat they do pose to the American sort of vision of slave expansion is a loss of dollars. It's an economic loss. These slaves are fleeing deep South plantations, and they're not returning. And so that's a capital loss to a lot of slave owners across the southern frontier. The fort becomes known, historians today we refer to it as the largest maroon colony in the history of the present day United States. I grew up watching Gilligan's Island. I'm very familiar to be marooned on an island. People might wonder, where does that word come from? That word comes from the Atlantic slave trade. And when Africans caught in the Atlantic slave trade would escape from slave ships, and sometimes the ships would wreck and they would escape, or sometimes the ships would dock, and as the slaves were being disembarked, they would escape into places like Panama, Cuba, Brazil. Jamaica was maroon colonies. So marooned on an island comes from the word maroon, which refers to fugitive slaves from a Spanish word. So point being, there are maroon colonies throughout the Americas during the era of slavery. But Negro Fort, by 1816, it became the largest maroon colony. Again, it's a colony of just African American people, most of them fugitive slaves, and they simply want to be left alone. They want to recreate sort of life they enjoyed in Africa when they were free. But a lot of these people were probably born into slavery in the Americas. They're second or third generation slaves. And so I think at least the evidence suggests, they simply want to recreate on some level a community. And so my book talks a lot about this free Black community. They want to be left alone. They want to be independent, militant. And these men who protect the fort, they drill every day. They wear uniforms. They practice hunt in the woods. throughout the Apalachicola National Forest, we call it today. So it's a pretty amazing story of just these black men, women, and sort of just trying to fight for their independence. A couple of other things about this fort: the British had left it stuffed with supplies. Numbers here. They left some 3,000 muskets, pistols, and swords. They left 500 kegs of gunpowder, a massive quantity of British clothing, including the redcoats. Regarding political organization, it's hard to say, but it was really martial law. You had some of these veterans of the British Marines, so former Spanish slaves in Florida. There's three of them that come to mind. There's a guy named Cyrus, there's a Prince, and there's a man named Garcon. They're all from Pensacola, and they were highly skilled artisans. Cyrus was well known as being very literate, could read and write as well as anyone. Garcon was a blacksmith. Prince was a lieutenant in the British Marines, was a great recruiter of African Americans throughout Florida for the British Marines. So these men were in charge, and it was a very militant situation, and they were sort of always on the defensive, always on the alert to prepare for some sort of attack from either the Spanish or increasingly clear that the Americans are likely to attack them. Another thing about Negro Fort was how successful it was, quite frankly. Several hundred men, women, and children, black men, women, and children, most of them fugitive slaves. In a year plus that they were independent, fields, small plantations that they had spread some 50 miles up the Apalachicola River through hunting and trade with the Seminoles and the Creeks and the Choctaws. They had plenty of food. Apparently, they had ships that were left by the British, accused of raiding boats up and down the Apalachicola. There's no evidence of that, but they certainly took back. In fact, when the British left them this fort, and a British flag will always fly over this fort, over quote unquote Negro Fort, but the African Americans at Negro Fort, they were told by the British, do not let any white person pass the fort unless they are British. And so the slaves still have some sort of connection to the British who promised them their freedom, for them these certificates of freedom, and I'll show you a picture of that if I can. And it's very hard to see, it's small, but on the left side you have a two-sided document, and I've just taken snapshots of the front and back, and you see the signature at the bottom. There's a lieutenant colonel for the British Marines. His name is Edward Nichols. And once you fought for the British, if you were a former slave, when the British evacuated Florida, you get this certificate, and it's almost like a passport saying to the world that you are a British subject now. You are a free person. You're a veteran of His Majesty's services, and no one can touch you. And so you can imagine if you were a Spanish slave, American slave, or a British slave, formerly, now you have the empire on the planet has given you a document saying that you are a free person, and that will not change. So it's a pretty incredible story of the British promising and actually delivering freedom to a lot of formerly enslaved people. Okay, so let's get to the summer of 1815 again. The fort is emerging. The Indians have left. The British have left. The Americans are concerned. The Americans are annoyed. As I said, Benjamin Hawkins is sending spies up and down the Apalachicola River, and some images start to emerge. And you see here over on the left, I love this picture. Here's sort of where Apalachicola Bay begins, and here's the site of Prospect Bluff. This is a large gunpowder magazine. This was called a redan that actually shot out over the river. Here are a bunch of storehouse, barracks, and all sorts of things. Originally, you see it here, they would build this wooden stockade. And if you go to this site today, there's still a big trench there, and there's still a trench around the gunpowder magazine. Ultimately, the British here and here, this is what everyone remembers about Negro Fort, these two items here. It's the same thing, just drawn differently. This is a massive structure, 8 feet tall, 60, 70, 80 feet across. It's hollow in the middle where soldiers are going out, and some of them will live and even sleep there. But it's a gunpowder magazine surrounded by these massive walls of timber and dirt. And it became known as the quote unquote, the Citadel. So it's this massive thing. It's a 20-foot high walls, and there's a 10-foot, dirt mound that is 30-foot high structure, 60, 70 feet across. See it from miles away as you row down, if you sail down the river. And so the point is, Negro Fort was, what's the word? Intimidating to anyone who might want to visit. Can you imagine traveling down the Apalachicola River in 1815? And there are 5 boats that greet you as you approach the site, and you see 20 black men, former slaves, veterans of the British Marines, many of them speaking Spanish or French, wearing red coats, carrying British muskets, telling you you are not welcome here, unless, of course, you're British or Native American, or maybe if you offer them something that they absolutely need. And then there are stories of some of these visitors are allowed to enter the fort, and they are all intimidated by these black men who tell them, who vow that they will not go back to slavery. Very famously, on 2 occasions, the Spanish government of Florida had sent representatives to Negro Fort to literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, to politely ask hundreds of these slaves who had run away to return to Pensacola, to St. Augustine. And out of the hundreds of slaves that they politely asked, I think 3 or 4 actually, I think it was 5. It was 5 women. They may have had husbands back in these parts of the territories. They may have had children back in these other parts of territories. But the hundreds of slaves, the vast majority said, no, thank you. And in fact, they usually wouldn't even say, no, thank you, dare you to try to take them back to slavery. So now let's get to sort of the crux of the story of the Battle of Negro Fort. Point being, the United States of America was not going to tolerate sort of this safe haven for fugitive slaves in the early decades of the 19th century. And it's anyone who studies the 19th century, you hear about the Underground Railroad, the Fugitive Slave Act, and all these things. And fugitive slaves, historians really focus on this today.
I'm sorry, it looks like we've lost Dr. Clavin for a minute. We will reconnect. There he is. Okay.
I'm back.
You're back?
Shall I proceed?
Yes.
Okay,
We're
good.
good. Okay.
As I was saying, so the Americans were not going to tolerate a safe haven for fugitive slaves, is the bottom line. So in the year that Negro Fort exists, what you see in the United States is what I refer to as a propaganda war. And there's really 3 sources of the propaganda. It's slave-owning settlers, and they're in Florida and Georgia, Mississippi Territory, as far west as New Orleans. Second group are Army officials, government officials, Benjamin Hawkins, Indian officials for the American government. Third is the national media, and it's predominantly Southern media I'm referring to, but Northern media as well, they are all collectively going to start to spread this narrative that Negro Fort poses an existential threat to the lives of Southerners. And looking back on it, there's no evidence for this. As I hope, the slaves just want to be left alone. They want to farm, they want to live with families, and they want to be free. And it's that simple. But the Americans want Florida. You know, many Americans, the president on down, they see Florida as eventually a massive, cotton plantation. Little do they know you can't grow cotton in many parts of Florida. But what they absolutely understood, especially on the Panhandle, the Escambia River, the Apalachicola River, all the way down to the Suwannee River, these were waterways to export cotton from the Deep South. And so Florida, is one of the first places that, is a part of Manifest Destiny. Americans, the United States, needs Florida. It doesn't just want Spanish Florida, it needs Florida. So what they began in 1815 and 1816, use Negro Fort as a pretext for war by making the argument that fugitive slaves, Native Americans, and people they refer to as vagabonds, as renegades, these white men who they claim are helping Negro Fort survive. They tell this very scary story that Americans' lives are in danger. So we must destroy this fort. And it doesn't take long, but people sort of ask and send out feelers, sort of, to see if Andrew Jackson would be interested in taking out Negro Fort. And he very much is. And say what you will about Andrew Jackson, he's a great American patriot. He's known for, the age of democracy and all sorts of things, but he was a big-time slave owner, a big-time slave trader, and he is going to seize the moment. He sees this opportunity to build his own legend. The British, New Orleans, defeated the Creeks, the Red Stick Creeks, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and elsewhere, and now he's this great opportunity to secure the southern border for slave owners, to capture these fugitive slaves, return them to their owners. And actually what the Battle of Negro Fort originates as is a slave hunting expedition. This is the American government sending troops and their Indian allies into a foreign country, Spanish Florida, without congressional approval, so it's unconstitutional, and they will invade this fort, destroy it, capture the soldiers, re-enslave them, pay bounties to the Creek Indians who captured them.
I think we might have lost him again. Yep. Okay, we'll refresh one more time. Wait for him to reconnect. Thank you all for your patience.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
All right, here we go. Let me bring the. Okay, so was it 1860, late 1815? So as I said, for many, many decades, the going rate, if you will, for a fugitive slave was about $15. So Native Americans were recruited to be these great slave catchers for American slave owners. Prior to the Battle of Negro Fort, the rate is bumped up to $50 per head. So for Creek Indians, even Seminole Indians who maybe not want to get involved in this conflict between Negro Fort and the United States, this great incentive to join the American side. So in June of 1816, several hundred Creek warriors and about 100 American troops, they leave Fort Scott on the Florida-Georgia border. They head towards Negro Fort on the water. You also have a naval contingent that comes from New Orleans, about 100 troops on several boats. They head up the Apalachicola River. Mid-July, they begin to clash with the fugitive slaves and a handful of Choctaw Indians. And for basically 2 weeks, you have this battle where you have hand-to-hand combat in the woods surrounding Negro Fort, right on the perimeter. You also have a lot of artillery fire going back and forth. Remember, these Negro Fort Maroons, this is a British fort that has this massive stockade. It has these cannons, 10-pounders, 15-pounders, the American gunboats. So it's a major battle. Very famously, July 27th, 1816, one of the U.S. Navy gunboats fires a quote-unquote hot shot, which was a heated cannonball. Some say it was lucky, some say it was skilled, that it was practiced for, and they had sort of distance, things of that nature. But one of these hot shots is going to land at the center of the citadel inside Negro Fort, where there are just literally hundreds and hundreds of pounds of gunpowder. And it just blows the fort to smithereens. Surrounding settlements, farms, stone warehouses, they're just destroyed. Legend has it that you could hear the explosion or feel the explosion as far away as Pensacola. When the smoke clears, an estimated 250 to 350 dead Negro Fort Maroons. If you visit the site of Negro Fort today, in the back of the historic site, there's what they call the quote-unquote cemetery, and there are about 15, 20 very deep impressions in the earth. And legend has it that underneath each of these impressions is where a mound of bodies was buried by the American military, these people who were murdered, the Negro Fort Maroons. And so it was in the hundreds for sure. Only 10 to 20, maybe 25 African Americans were actually captured and re-enslaved at the time. The Spanish slaves were given to the Indians and delivered mainly to Pensacola, I believe. If they were owned, actually Benjamin Hawkins recovered one of his slaves after the destruction of Negro Fort. And so the story sort of ends there. It's sort of this great victory for Jackson. It's a great victory for the United States. It's a great defeat for fugitive slaves. They used to have British allies. The British are gone. They used to have a Spanish territory that they felt safe escaping to. That is gone. And they used to just have this release valve. If you wanted to escape, just go south towards Florida. You can't do that anymore. There is no sort of temple of freedom, no sort of site of freedom to escape to like Negro Fort. That being said, this is actually not over. Several hundred slaves actually left the fort before the explosion during the battle. For dozens of years, even scores of years, through the Second Seminole War, the Third Seminole War, the 1850s, there are still veterans of Negro Fort and the British Marines who are fighting American expansion into Florida. We know that at least 100 fugitive slaves or Negro Fort Maroons made their way eventually to the Bahamas. Their descendants are still there today. In fact, if you Google Nichols Town on Andros Island in the Bahamas, this is where a lot of these Negro Fort Maroons migrated to, and they named their town after the British colonel who gave them their freedom papers. So it's a pretty incredible story. So I like to think that Negro Fort tells us several stories, but the main point I try to get across is that everyone knows that by the middle of the 19th century, by the eve of the Civil War, slave owners had an inordinate power over the levers of government, not just domestic policy, but foreign policy. And most people sort of date the slave power from the 1830s, no later than the mid-1840s. But I think Negro Fort shows that as early as the 18-teens, slave owners got their way. They wanted to invade Florida. They wanted to capture runaway slaves. They wanted to pay bounties to Indians. They got their wish. If you look at the founders, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons, they were slave owners, many of them. but every one of them was torn over the idea of slavery. They were born slave owners. They inherited slaves. George Washington got slaves when he married his wife, but they were troubled. They thought it was a necessary evil at best. Andrew Jackson was never troubled by ownership of Black people. He was never troubled by forced Indian removal. He represents a different type of American frontiersman, a different type of American political leader. And unfortunately for the United States, the slave power gets its way from the 18 teens until the 1860s. And the result is this horrific civil war. And so essentially it's the story of Negro Fort and sort of its impact, its importance to United States history. So thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions? Anybody want to type in the chat room or in the Q&A box? Oh, Diana, let me unmute you. Oh, you may have to unmute her because I think I made you host, so I don't have.
Yeah, the only name I see is Kenneth.
Oh,
I see.
you can't.
I see what. Yeah, I see the chat. What is the name of the book?
Oh. Okay, I'll go soon. Terry. Terry wants to know, this was Spanish Florida. What was Spain doing all this time?
Great question. Spain was faltering, honestly. And one of the reasons the Americans felt sort of entitled to Spanish Florida was the Spanish Empire crumbling. The British Empire is basically peaking at this time, which makes its defeat at New Orleans just so historical. But the Spanish Empire's best days were well behind it. Florida had always been sort of an outpost. They had never dedicated many resources to it, which is why they had welcomed Indians and fugitive slaves to help protect the boundaries against the Americans. And so ultimately, Spain is just watching. They control Florida, but they're letting Indians take territory. They're letting fugitive slaves in the United States, reside in this fort. They're letting the British do whatever the British want. And it's just sort of a sad story for Spain. Their best days are numbered. And so they see no threat from Spain. And if they want Spanish Florida, the threat is the Indians and fugitive slaves, not the Spanish government. And when they do take Negro Fort, Spain had actually sent a small naval expedition to sort of beat Jackson, and they were too late. But even if they had in the fort from the fugitive slaves, the United States was probably destined to get Spanish Florida anyway.
Okay. Diana actually wants to know, what is the name of your book?
The Battle of Negro Fort. Yeah.
Let me move.
There you go.
There it is. The Rise and Fall of a Fugitive Slave Community, the Battle of Negro Fort. Oh, Terry bought it at Midtown Reader.
Thank you. Thank you. I see someone has asked, have you heard new developments to the fort since Hurricane Michael came through? No, but I'm dying. And several people have contacted me. I've talked to several people. I'm still close to a lot of people in Florida. And it did serious damage to the site, which is horrible on one level, but there aren't structures that survive from this time period. But it did uproot a lot of trees that may have been around at the time. So archaeologists, as of several weeks, this is pre-pandemic actually, a lot of archaeological digs, or at least one huge one, is taking place. And I'm sure in the next couple months to year or two, they will have found bullets, they will have found shrapnel, they will have found, they already know where the foundation of these buildings are, like the Citadel. In fact, if you go there today, it's a very cool place to be. Where the Citadel was, they have it marked out with these spikes. And I think, there's trees in the vicinity that have been uprooted. And so I'm sure they will find debris moving forward, which is pretty cool.
Kenneth would like to know what inspired you to learn about and write about this history. which he thinks is fascinating and at the same time terrible, and we ought to be teaching these lessons in elementary school.
Yeah, yeah, in less than 3 hours. There's just a lot of reasons. I can honestly tell you, ever since I was a kid, there's an essay I wrote in like elementary school where I had seen roots when I was very, very little, and it just the whole mistreating people because they look different from you or they go to a different, religious. As a kid, I took great offense, and I still do. And it all just started when I was very, very little. And the more I read about it, and I definitely more for like the whole idea of Negro Fort or fugitive slavery, which is sort of fascinates me, is absolutely when I was in college and when I was in high school, they were still teaching this very offensive story that in the United States, slaves were treated well, slaves were happy. I mean, really, just insane stuff. And everyone knows enslavement is horrible. No one ever said Spartacus was treated well or the Egyptians treated slaves. But in American history, there are still people who will contend that in Virginia and in Florida, slaves were treated well. They were, and it drives me nuts. And so I've definitely made it part of my professional mission. And it's just the sources you choose to use. If you look at the right sources, if you only read slave owners' diaries, you will maybe be convinced that slaves were happy. But if you read the slave owners' newspapers, and oftentimes like in the Pensacola Gazette, the Tallahassee papers, the St. Augustine papers, the early Orlando and Miami papers from the 19th century, pre-Civil War, there are instances they have 8 runaway slave advertisements on the front page. And these slaves are running away. They are scarred. They are bruised. They have gunshot wounds that they've survived. And it makes it very clear that despite what slave owners are saying in their diaries, these slaves are just like us, man. They're humans, and they just want to be free. And they will do crazy things. They'll risk their lives. They'll get in boats. They'll climb mountains. They'll join the British. They'll do whatever it takes to be free. So I think if you study slavery, you can get very depressed, and you can be very, distraught over just, like today, it's a distressing time. But for whatever reason, when I read about these runaway slaves, these slave soldiers, I'm very inspired by their love of freedom and how willing they were to risk it all just to simply taste of freedom.
Okay, Diana would like to know how many descendants are in the Bahamas.
Say it again.
How many descendants are in the Bahamas?
I'd say hundreds. There are several articles that are probably now 10, 20 years old, but it's not difficult. If you can get yourself to Andros Island today, in a couple of hours, just talking to, and they're very friendly there, that you'll be descendants of these Negro Fort Maroons. And one of my favorite parts of my book is chapter, I think it is, but in as late as the 1840s, there are some court cases and just this little anecdotes of evidence I have found. And there are like elderly Black men who will reveal that there was a case over voting rights because Britain had freed the slaves in the British Empire in the 1830s. And in the 1830s and 40s, every once in a while, there's an election and certain candidates are trying to suppress the Black vote. And there's a Black Bahamian, and he pulls out one of these certificates signed by Edward Nichols at the British Post in the fall of 1815, saying, here is a British subject, giving him rights of a British citizen with vote. And so, I watch all the History Channel, history detectives, and I know someday somebody in the Bahamas is going to, reveal to the world that they have one of these certificates from ancestors, from the Battle of Negro or from the British Post. And so it's really incredible that these documents are out there. So the document I showed you the picture of, I found in the papers of Andrew Jackson. So Jackson certainly aware of these certificates being granted, of all these slaves being given their freedom in Florida. And as we learned, he was not happy about it.
Could you talk a little bit about, this is my personal question, but could you talk a little bit about how crowded or not crowded it was at the fort? I mean, you said there were 250 to 350 people who died and then hundreds that left. So, I
Yeah.
mean, in comparison to people fleeing to go there, I mean,
Right.
it had to be, in terms of slavery, a pretty dense environment.
Yeah, there were, the site of the Negro Fort, it was several football fields large, and I'd say no more than 200 or 300 people inside the wooded stockade of the fort, and those are most of the leaders, the soldiers, and maybe their wives and children. But you had a number of people who lived on those small farms, plantations beyond the fort. Most of them were up and down the Apalachicola River. Another cool thing I found early in my research, British archives, I think it was, this map, and it's years before the War of 1812, like around 1800, close to what is today the United States border on the western edge and eastern edge of the Apalachicola River. Somebody had drawn on a map these Black communities. So for dozens of years, Black people had escaped into Spanish Florida, or they'd already escaped from other parts of Spanish Florida. Many joined the Indians, but a lot of them built these small communities. And so when the British come, they just integrate themselves into Negro forts, society, but they had been free for probably 20, 30 years. So, Spanish Florida just has this really extraordinarily unique history regarding fugitive slaves. And as I said with the British before, it's not that the Spanish government loved fugitive slaves necessarily, but they need protection. And citizens, they needed colonists, they needed soldiers. They welcomed these fugitive slaves from the British and French Empire. So there was always sort of a place for fugitive slaves in Spanish.
Okay. Any other questions? No. Nope, something popped up. How can we stay, Diana would like to know, how can we stay in touch with you to present to nonprofit organizations?
Email, send me email, mjclavin@uh.edu. Or if you just go to the University of Houston History Department website, you can track down my contact information.
Or you can contact me and I'll share it with you if you don't get that written down. And Kenneth says we are homeschooling and we want our students to learn about this and comprehend and appreciate the way in which we as a culture have treated Africans in our country. He's not talking about just Black History Month, but he's talking about what really happened.
Right.
Agree, Kenneth? Very, very good. And R. Williams, have you done any research in Cuba, which is very connected to Florida?
No. However, I did all the research at the University of Florida, primarily in Spanish documents. Many of them are from Cuban archives. And some of those court cases I mentioned where slaves are pulling out these certificates 20, 30, 40 years later, some of that they come from Cuban records as well, where there were Cuban, they were like shipwreckers and things like that on the western shore of the Florida Panhandle, like near Tampa. And they were the ones who were delivering these slaves to the Bahamas. So I'm sure the slaves had to give them a British gun or two, or maybe a keg of gunpowder or a red coat, and they'd give them free passage to the Bahamas. So there was a connection to Cuba throughout this entire time. And for the person about I mentioned the schooling, and I have written 3 books, and this one is a little bit different because oftentimes historians are really encouraged and even forced to write books that are somewhat esoteric, for other historians primarily. But once you get to your second book, you get a little more freedom and you get to do something a little more for a popular audience. And this book is really intended for really undergraduate students, high school teachers, advanced high school teachers. I have 3 teenagers. My daughter, who's a freshman in college, she's read it. So I mean, it's depending on the student, it's a narrative history. It's not some sort of esoteric monograph that delves into these massive footnotes and all that stuff. So I wouldn't assign it until you read it first, but to make this a readable book for people who just might be a little bit interested in Florida history, the history of runaway slaves, and then I think it will, just by having this hook of Negro Fort, they might just learn a whole lot more than they expected, just about American history, Spanish history, African American history in general, Native American history in general.
Mm-hmm. And with that, Kenneth would like to know, do you have any recommendations for a curriculum?
What do you mean by a curriculum?
What do you mean, Kenneth? He says a course of study. For his, I guess, for his homeschooling.
Yeah, I mean, like, curriculum to me really implies, like, how do you teach over an extended period of time? I would just tell you, sort of in general, and this is, Lacey, you had said something a couple of minutes earlier. The way I am an American historian, and I'm proud of it. And I do a lot of world history and Atlantic history. And everyone's different, but the way I teach American history, and it's not sort of any intentional thing, I think it has to be taught this way, but African American history, Native American history, women's history, it's a huge part of it. And, don't like sort of the bifurcation of history, and you should study this group, and or only this group or only that group. I just think you need to study American history, but it's an inclusive history, and it does not mean you teach a history that everybody got along and sang kumbaya all the time, because they. But my publication record is very deep into slavery and slave resistance. That's a huge part of American history. So I just think you teach curriculum-wise an inclusive American history that is very diverse, like the country we live in today. It doesn't privilege one group over another, but it just tells this story. And what has always made the United States, one of the things that's made the United States exceptional is our diversity. But as part of that diversity, I think today we think of it as everybody got along, a diverse city, a diverse neighborhood, diverse. But America was diverse when there was slavery, when there was Indian removal. And so you have to tell the story of these conflicts, for better or worse. That's American history. And so you just don't privilege a group. Well, you got to tell and you can tell the story of, and you want to teach, you can use a source of a slave owner and their diary saying how happy slaves were and content, and how when the slave ran away, they were so confused because they loved their slave. Why would the slave demonstrate to them that they loved them as well? Well, little did they know, the slave was acting, performing that contentment, because that slave didn't want to be sold away from his or her family members. And so then you tell the story using a source of the runaway slave, or read Frederick Douglass's narrative, and he makes it very clear he was never happy as a slave. I mean, he was hopeless on occasion. He had given up on occasion, but oftentimes he was a rebellious spirit. And so you just have to tell both of those stories. That's American history. I believe in a very sort of broad history and inclusive history, but slavery is so central to American history. Race has always been the biggest problem or conflict, if not one of, it's the biggest one. Economic equality is a close second. But this is American history, and to not just understand the past, but to get through this period we're in now, to improve our country, to attain all the lofty goals that we have and ideals, you got to reckon with this stuff. And I think that's where history really has a role in the crisis of 2020, the crises of 2020.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kenneth followed up with, where do you find such an inclusive American history? And I think Dr. Clavin's point is there is no inclusive American history. You have to go to each source, and like he said, you're going to have to pull a Frederick Douglass. You're going to have to pull one of the enslaved transcriptions from an oral history or something like that, and which are online now, they're being put online through National Archives and different sources. So and pull the enslaved stories, and pull the story from the slave owners and compare the two and show that you're not getting the true story from the slave owners anymore.
And I'll just add that, I teach intro U.S. history several times a year, and I am now using a textbook by Douglas Brinkley, and it's far from perfect, but it's good, and I browse online other professors' syllabi all the time. So just, go to any local university or university in Seattle, Washington, doesn't matter. Browse their syllabi online. Most college textbooks are really good, and they've been vetted time and time again. And so I have a son who's going into 11th grade. I'm making him read the textbook I use right now. He's not doing a good job, but I'm trying to make him read it this summer so he's prepared for the fall semester. So just, you have to be careful with textbooks sometimes, but usually if they're from a major publisher, a historian at a major school, they're going to be good enough. And start there maybe. And then like you said, Lacey, you just go online. So much is online today. Women's history, Native American history, immigrant history, founding fathers history, everything they wrote, for goodness sakes, every private letter, diary, it's all online. Andrew Jackson, most of it's online. And so there's no excuse if your internet connection works, honestly, to really,
absolutely,
to dig deep into the history.
Okay, does it look like we've got any more questions right now? We got some comments. Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
People looking forward to reading your book, which I think we all are. I went back to check our library to make sure we had it. So anybody got anything else before we let Dr. Clavin have a lovely evening in Texas?
Here's what I would recommend you do if you decide to read the book.
Oh.
Is to go visit the Apalachicola National Forest and the Prospect Bluff site. It's one of the few places, I don't know if it's changed, but the last time I was there 5-6 years ago, you still couldn't get cell phone reception. It's so remote. And there'll be like one park ranger there, and they probably won't even know. And actually it was closed, again, pre-pandemic because of the hurricane or the storm. But when it opens up, if it's open now, get there. It's a day trip if you're in Tallahassee, and less than that, and walk around in half an hour. And it's really an incredible that very few people know about. And many times I've taken students there, and we'll stop, at a fast food joint or gas station along the way. People who have lived there 20 miles away their entire life have never heard of it. They've never heard of Negro Fort or the British or any of that stuff. So it really is a forgotten part of Florida history. So get yourself to that site if you can.
Absolutely. It's not very far away from Tallahassee. If you're here, please go visit it. It is a super special place. As Terry agrees, call the Forest Service first. They'll let you know if they're open. And we would, I support the Forest Service and go see it. We will be here next week again at 6 p.m. Talking with the Tallahassee Memorial Health Department with nutrition and immunology during a pandemic and how to take care of yourself. So it's a little bit of a different angle next week, but that is okay. We all need it right now. So we're going to talk with Tallahassee Memorial and see what they have to say, or TMH. So I want to thank Dr. Clavin again for being here. It was so great to see Texas. I'm from Texas, so I miss. And it's sunny there. It rained all day here, so
it's hot today. Boy, it's hot today. So
I can imagine. All right, take care, and everybody out there, stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.